Hi do-it-yourselfers, welcome to GeekDIYMechanic. This video is going to talk about the process I use to troubleshoot. What I would like to do is share the process I use to troubleshoot an issue someone tells me about their car. What I suggest is that you listen to my process, try to understand it the best you can, and then modify it and tweak it and make your own. And you actually have an advantage over me because you know how I do it, and then you're going to have your own. So you have two ways to attack issues that you encounter while working on cars. Again, customize it for yourself. We all do things differently. This is just one way that I do it. At an overall level, I do data gathering. That's learning the issue from the driver, the owner of the car. I then stay in this loop where I research, determine tests to run, understand the potential outcomes and what they mean. The sensor, should it have 5 volts when it's disconnected or not, things like that. And then I see if there's multiple ways I can test a component. And then I keep doing that until I find the root cause. Once I find the root cause, I determine what needs to be fixed to resolve that root cause. Is it an alternator, IAC, is it bad wiring, things like that. And then I determine how best to install and fix those components or parts or the wiring. And that right there, research is important there, so you follow industry best practices. And then when it's all installed and fixed, I then verify the fix by usually running the same tests I use to determine the root cause. And then I keep notes and findings, sort of like a diary, because part of the research is that you should see what you did before and learn from it. Let's talk about data gathering. This at a high level is where you try to gain as much information from the driver as you can, and you don't try to steer them to their story or how to describe the issue. You want to listen and ask clarification questions of what's going on. When did you first notice it? How is the car acting different from what you normally are used to? And then I see if the check engine light is on, and then I ask them how long has it been on? Is it intermittent? Does it turn on and off? And then I perform an inspection, just high-level inspection. They say, oh, my right wheel is making an issue. I sort of just look at it and maybe ask them questions, the things I find or something like that. I then say, when was the car last serviced? What parts were changed? Who performed the service? Was it a dealership, a garage, themselves, a do-it-yourselfer, or whatever? And then I also ask if I can see invoices, because those invoices are sort of a history of what the car has gone through. You can see if they're good about maintenance of their car, or they sort of let things go. You can also see if on the invoice the mechanic told them about an issue, but they decided not to take care of it. Their fluid's low, or they fill fluid every time it's serviced. Why is that? Things like that. And then I try to determine, when does the issue occur? Is it when the engine is cold, warm, a hot start? What's the temperature outside? What's the environment like? And what's the driver doing when it occurs? The reason I ask those specific questions, or want those questions answered, is those can tell me which strategy the PCM is using to operate the car. Strategies like an algorithm. When you start a cold engine, the strategy is different than a hot start. So that's important to know. Different sensors are used, things like that. I try to determine, is it engine based? So I say, is it at a specific RPM, or is it a specific speed you notice it? Is it when you turn the car or going straight? Is it when you change direction? You know, you're parking into a parking stall and you're backing in and out. Is that when you hear it? Or just driving straight? Again, try not to influence the story they tell you. Try to really listen. Here's where I loop. I tend to spend most of my time here in this loop section. I try to, ASC, professional mechanics, have a big leg up on us do-it-yourselfers. They have been professionally trained. They've gone to a trade school and really been taught automobiles. You and I, we have to learn the systems or the best tricks of the trade. So I like to go to the same things they look at. I like to use the actual manufacturer shop manual. I prefer them over the generic shop manuals. Hard copy I prefer, but you can use a soft copy. I also a lot of times use online tools that give me access to shop manuals, TSBs, recalls, things like that. I'm going to show you Mitchell. I really like Mitchell, and just for clarity, I'm not being paid by Mitchell at all for this. This is just giving you my opinion on their tool. So this is a Mitchell wiring diagram for a 2012 Nissan Rogue. What I like about using Mitchell diagrams is they convert them all into their notation. So I don't have to spend lots of time learning the wiring diagram notation. And what I mean by that, if you look at a Ford wiring diagram and let's say a Toyota wiring diagram, they're very different. They use different symbols. And that takes me a while to figure out what they're trying to get at. So I like Mitchell because I'm used to it now and I understand their symbols they use. Again, that's just my opinion. You don't have to. This is a subscription purchase. You can, I believe, I don't recall. Please go to their website to see their billing option, but it is a per year, make, model subscription. They have a variety. I think it's very reasonable to do the job right. But again, it's what works for you. And again, on Mitchell, you can get at the recalls and TSBs. The reason I like to look at recalls is that maybe it's a recurring issue. Okay, the difference between a recall and a TSB is very simple. There's a couple, but here's the major one. A recall is an issue, recurring issue, of which is safety oriented. If you remember, like, bad tires were installed, or the car would surprisingly accelerate. Those had to be fixed by the manufacturer because those are safety related. A TSB are common problems that the field finds and submits, and then they become a TSB, a technical service bulletin. The difference, one of the major differences, is a recall tends to have one issue, one solution. A TSB, you can have multiple TSBs solving the same issue, and they have different ways of fixing it. So really read through all the TSBs and determine which ones work for you, and if there is a TSB for your specific issue that you're encountering. So what I like about carcomplaints.com, again, I'm not being paid by them. I just wanted to show, I like this feature where I go to complaints and then I ask what the issue is, and let's say that in this particular case it's transmission problems. So I click on transmission problems and then ask them, or try to determine if it's potentially one of these, and then I hit the loss of acceleration, and then I see other people's issues, the way they resolved it. Sometimes they took it to the dealer, it's a known issue, they referred to a TSB. So that's why I like this site. Sometimes it has helped me, sometimes it hasn't, but just wanted to share one of the tools that I use. There are many others that do the same thing. I then also review my diary of the previous fixes and jobs I've done before, because maybe there's a trick in there that would help me with this issue. I also use the internet and search for submissions and posts that could help me, but I'm very picky. I want posts that tell me how it works, how to test it, and what should be the result. I don't follow forum entries or posts that say change a part and that should fix it. Don't be a parts changer. Know exactly the issue and change the appropriate part. Lastly, some higher level scan tools have the ability to describe the systems that make up the car: ignition system, transmission, ABS, whatever. And then they give you component descriptions, the actual connectors and specific wire layouts and how they should behave. And in addition, some of the scan tools allow you to subscribe, and then you have access to a mechanics database. They give you much more detailed tests and results and how they solved it. That can be very helpful. I then also try to learn how pieces of functionality relate to each other. Modern cars, since they're computer oriented, they have subsystems or components that rely on other components to do their job. For example, if I'm looking at why an ignition coil is not firing, I might need to look at some of these to determine what's going on. Is it receiving coil power? Is it receiving coil control? What kind of coil is it? Coil over plug, wasted spark, that's all pertinent. Is the ignition switch where the key is that working? How does that system work? Ignition module, does it have an ignition module, or does the PCM control it? The ignition module or PCM probably takes a crank and cam sensor as input to know the position of the engine, to know when to fire the ignition and fuel injectors. Is there an alarm system? Maybe that's cutting out a specific subsystem of the car. Maybe the PCM is faulty. Or how does the PCM, what does it need to do its job? What inputs does it need? How are its outputs working? Things like that. So that's why I look at a modern car as a series of components all relating and working together. And you have to understand that relationship to truly debug and determine and understand what's going on. I then determine the tests to run. I understand what potential outcomes could mean. And if possible, I try to determine numerous ways to test a component. And I keep doing that until I find root cause. Sometimes this determining the tests can be challenging. You have to be open-minded and creative. Sometimes you need special tools. So you may need to borrow, rent, or determine that a test is beyond your capability. So you may have to skip it, test everything else but that component. Just giving you some experience that I've had, and maybe you want to test that component from numerous angles. Let's say you do have the test procedures or the appropriate tools. I always like multiple tests to verify it. That's not always possible. And then make sure in your research steps you know what the outcome should be. Don't assume the outcome. For example, when you're testing an ignition coil, just because it sparks doesn't mean that's good enough. Without going into great detail, you want to make sure it's a strong spark. There's tests that you can run to make sure it's a good strong spark. Something like that. And then you want to keep running your tests of system and subcomponents until you find the root cause. Once you find root cause, you need to determine what needs to be fixed or maybe cleaned. I've had some luck with mass air meters, EGR and spark plugs, where I was able to clean them and put them right back in and the car was fixed. Sometimes that isn't the case. In addition, sometimes that one part, you really should change other parts as well. For example, usually when you change spark plugs, you change the plugs, wires, cap, and rotor, if appropriate, right? Why? Because they're all a unit. They've all been usually the same age. Maybe there's carbon trails on there, and you want to make sure all of that is out of your system. Another example is like when you change your timing belt. That's not really an issue, that's just a normal maintenance, right? But when you change your timing belt, best practices for 4-cylinder engines where it's deep inside a timing belt cover. Inside there is classically your water pump, you have a belt tensioner, and maybe crank sensor. And usually best practice is to change all of those. While you have it open, you change all of those. So that's why you want to do research and determine how you should properly install these parts. Maybe additional parts or subsystems need to be worked on as well. Determine how best to install and fix. This is where I carefully read the shop manual and then do research, go on the YouTube and look at other people to do their install. Sometimes they'll show you little tricks, but then I evaluate how much I should trust or use what they do based on the shop manual. Did they follow all the steps? Were they safe? Did they just jack up the car using a floor jack, or did they also put a jack stand under the car? Those little things can tell you if they're really into detail. Did they torque the nuts appropriately? So I tend to favor the professional mechanic because they do it right. If they do it wrong, they'll be out of business, or they'll have a poor reputation. And in my opinion, these professional mechanics online have given me great advice. Eric the Car Guy, Ford Tech Make You Loco, South Main Auto Repair. He's given some great tips on diagnosing and checking things. And my favorite is Scanner Danner, great auto diagnostic teacher. But yet he was able to teach me a great trick about how to work on an air conditioning system. He gave me a great trick on how to depressurize a manifold gauge set. I tend to favor the professional mechanic, but that doesn't mean the do-it-yourselfer like you and I would not give great advice. You need to determine how to properly install a component. Like, should you use anti-seize? What type of anti-seize? Are there special precautions that you need? How deep on the thread you should put the anti-seize? Should you use dielectric? The spark plugs, can you gap them? Some you can't. You'll ruin the coating, and you actually make the spark plug not last long and be less effective. So you really want to read instructions, do your research to properly install. In addition, sometimes if you didn't do research, you may not do the job right. Like if you had to change an air conditioning compressor, which looks like sort of an alternator, it's a pump, you would just change that part. No, you can't do that. Air conditioning system is a very complicated system. It's a closed system. So usually when you change your air conditioner, you have to do additional steps that a lot of times the do-it-yourselfer can't do. You may have to work with a mechanic, but again, that's beyond the scope of this video. But I wanted to illustrate just changing an air conditioning compressor. You need to evacuate the system, add compressor oil, change your reed valve, change your dryer, pull a vacuum on the system, and then charge the system. Again, this wasn't intended to teach you about AC, but I just wanted to show sometimes changing a component involves many steps or special tools or knowledge, additional knowledge. That's all I was trying to get at with this. Verify fix. Again, I like to verify fix if possible from numerous angles. Sometimes it's real obvious. You drive over a bump and it doesn't make a grinding sound anymore. You fixed it. Sometimes you have to be clever, use your scan tool. A lot of times when you change certain components, you have to clear the learn mode of the computer, make it relearn the new component like an O2 sensor, throttle body, or whatever. You have to have it relearn. And a lot of times when you clear those, you also clear the readiness codes. And I like to, if possible, determine the appropriate readiness monitor drive cycle and run that to make sure the part that I changed works correctly. For most fixes, I try to do a test drive to verify the fix. Many times when you change a component like an O2 sensor, a throttle body, you have to have the PCM relearn that component. So when you clear those, the learning, sometimes they'll invalidate a readiness monitor, and you'll want to, at least I like to, learn the drive cycle necessary for that readiness monitor and drive it. See if I can get it to execute and to complete without a trouble code set. That way I know for sure that fix is done. Sometimes it's very obvious, other fixes, right? When you go over a bump, it doesn't make the grinding noise anymore, or whatever. So again, it depends on what you're changing, what you do, but I try to be as thorough testing it as possible to reduce it returning back. Keeping notes. I think this is very important. I always try to save waveforms, PID normal values, because those are usually hard to get. Like what's at wide open throttle, what should be the TPS percentage? Believe it or not, it's not always 100%. It's not even 90 in some cars. Sometimes it's 75%. But how would you know that? So that's why I save them. Specific manufacturers tend to sort of resemble each other. I also try to write down the diagnostic procedures and what worked for that job and what didn't, so I learn. I'm constantly trying to tune my skills. For the pro, I suggest, I'll be honest, a pro is probably not listening to this video, but if they are, they probably do this already. It's the one-offs, the things they don't normally work on, they would write down, what they did, maybe, waveforms, PIDs, or whatever. But they have access to so much resources compared to the do-it-yourselfer. So for the do-it-yourselfer, to me it's very useful to keep that, and maybe you can help a friend or share it on a forum and help someone else out. So that's why I like to keep notes. I didn't put that on there, but the best part of troubleshooting is the celebration part, meaning you nailed it, you solved the issue. For the pro, they again, they're probably not listening to this, but they get the job done right. It's not coming back, and they get paid. For the do-it-yourselfer, you probably saved yourself some money, pride in fixing it yourself. Perhaps you helped a friend, and you increased your experience. I just really enjoy solving issues. It's a great high for me. So a recap, again, everyone has their own unique style. You definitely want to be very fluid and willing to change going at and diagnosing an issue. For example, on some cars it's easy to test the fuel pressure. Others it's not. So you might want to put that test off and test other tests that are easier to run. For example, crank no start, you want to see is fuel being delivered, or is spark. Sometimes it's easy, like on a Ford, because there's a Schrader valve. Bang, you put your fuel pressure gauge on there, you can tell if there's fuel pressure. Other cars, like a Subaru, that's not so easy, so maybe you attack spark. Things like that. So be fluid, don't be so rigid, because each car, each condition, each problem can be challenging and different and unique. In addition, you may need to learn or get at special tools to test. Like a lot of modern cars, you can't get at the primary waveform, spark waveform. You have to use secondary. You may need special tools, an inductive ignition tester, for example, to see that secondary waveform. So you may have to put that test off to see, or call in a friend to help you out, or rent it, a tool. Again, stay calm. Use your knowledge. That's why the research step is the most important. So you can be flexible, be fluid. It keeps your mind open. And lastly, I think the research knowledge, which produces knowledge, research produces knowledge, is key. That helps you navigate that system. If you don't know the type of ignition system, it's going to be really hard to debug it. So you not only need to know the type of system, you need to know how it works. And using TSBs and recalls to see how they commonly break. Wires and some GM vans, the PCM is in such an area that as the car ages, water tends to get on it and fries it. But it'd be nice to know that ahead of time so you could look at that. Things like that. This knowledge is key, and patience and doing it. Slow is fast. That's sort of one of my main mottos. Slow is fast. Well, I hope you found my process helpful. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the information helpful.